Now, joining us now to give his review is former BBC Royal correspondent Michael Cole. Michael, good afternoon to you. I mean, just on the point of Prince Andrew, and by the way, I think he's been spotted today out in public. Is this likely to have any effect on him at all? I mean, you couldn't really throw any more at the man. He's lost his status, he's lost his credibility, he's lost his job. Is a Netflix documentary going to make it any worse for a bloke that's had all of that on his lap for the last couple of years?
Good afternoon, Ian. Of course, Scoop is not a documentary. It's a dramatization with some invented scenes. It is indeed a work of art, and the only true purpose of art is to reveal the truth. So does Scoop reveal the truth? Yes, I think it does. It's plausible, it's believable, and when you get past the interminable BBC politics, which it shows too much of and not enough behind the scenes at the palace. But once you get past that, it is, in classical terms, it's a tragedy. It's the fall from a very high pedestal of a man because of hubris, because of vanity, and because of absolute sheer stupidity. Rufus Sewell, who we saw there as Prince Andrew, he gives a monumental performance. I'm sure he'll get accolades and awards galore. And in the end, Ian, he makes you feel almost sorry for Prince Andrew. And I'm sure that princes of the royal blood don't want people feeling sorry for them. They want people to admire them. If not admire them, then respect them. And in this whole tragedy, one thing which I think was not accentuated sufficiently was the true tragedy, which is that of countless numbers of underage girls, children who were trafficked and abused by this appalling, evil, unlamented financier in New York, Jeffrey Epstein, and whose lives were damaged, if not ruined, by those experiences. They are mentioned, of course, but not sufficiently. And of course, in the interview itself, although Emily Maitlis gave the prince plenty of opportunities to say how sorry he was and to try and make reparation and try to explain himself, he didn't take those opportunities, and that was the sadness of it. Ian, I did the first television interview Prince Andrew ever did, in company with Anthony Carthew of ITN in 1986, on the day his engagement to Sarah Ferguson was announced. I interviewed him at the palace where this is set, and that, of course, was a much happier interview. On those days, they were a happy young couple. He was just back, not long from the Falklands, where he'd served properly and loyally and with some distinction. And he was a very popular figure. And they were a blessed couple. Of course, we couldn't say then, we couldn't see how dreadful it would become in later years for personal reasons, culminating in this dreadful interview on the 19th of November, 2019. And Ian, I was up at BBC in Manchester at 7 o'clock in the morning, 14 hours before this programme was put out. And the presenter said to me, he said, well, doesn't Prince Andrew clear the air about this matter? I said, that's the absolute reverse of that. This is a catastrophe. He couldn't have done anything worse. And whoever advised him to do it was not giving him good advice. In fact, was putting his head in the lion's mouth.
And what was interesting, Michael, as you will remember, and I think this is probably covered in the drama, he was very happy with it afterwards. He thought he'd done a stunning job. And I can only imagine he felt he'd imparted every line, every angle that he'd been advised to do so, and he felt he was fluent. He didn't lose the plot, and based probably on that alone, he thought this would clear the air somewhat and it would be the return. But I don't know on what basis he would have thought that, because there were so many reasons why this interview was horrendous for him. The content, Pizza Express, not sweating, goodness knows what else. I mean, it was mumbo-jumbo for much of it.
It was appalling. I revert to what I said. It was hubris, it was pride, it was vanity, it was sheer stupidity. And of course, the character played by Keeley Hawes, who was his press advisor, she left Buckingham Palace fairly soon thereafter. And of course, within a couple of days of that interview being transmitted on a Saturday evening, he'd withdrawn from public life,
Yep.
from royal duties, from all. He's lost all his titles, all his honors, all his ranks in the armed forces. And that will, I'm afraid, go on forever.
Yep.
This scoop, and of course there is, as you know, another production going over the same ground coming up fairly soon. That's the Emily Maitlis version of this. This is the version of a producer who was fairly low on the Newsnight totem pole, called Sam McAllister. It's her view, and she's the heroine of the story, without any doubt. And Prince Andrew, of course, is the bogeyman. He's the villain. He is, but he's a rather pathetic figure. And honestly, Ian, it makes me sad to see it, because I knew him all those years ago. I started reporting on him when he was riding the Calgary Stampede in Alberta, Canada, when he was 17 years old. And I saw him on board HMS Brazen, HMS Invincible, when he was a helicopter pilot. And I went on the early tours with him and Sarah Ferguson. And they were a breath of fresh air. They were warmly welcomed around the world. And I must say, of all the Queen's 4 children, he was the one who was always more amiable, more open, and more approachable. So I feel very sorry for him, but I feel even more sorry for the victims of this appalling Epstein. And that, I'm afraid, goes to the lack of judgment, a horrendous lack of judgment on the part of Prince Andrew.
I read an interview, I think it was last weekend, might have been in the Sunday Times, of the photographer that was booked to go along to this interview just to take the still photographs, pretty much stand in the background. He wasn't told who it was for or what it was for until the day, as they often do, as you know, for these kind of events. And eventually he was told on the morning, you've got to turn up at the palace, and then he found out what it was. And he said that while he was snapping away, took hundreds of photographs in the background as it was all being filmed. He said he was more than aware that this was kind of grim history in the making. He was aware that these were jaw-dropping moments, that what was happening here was powerful stuff that was going to make huge headlines around the world. He said you could just feel it. And yet the only person that didn't seem to be aware of that was the prince himself. So sure was he that this was an exercise in rediscovery almost.
I think you'd have to be pretty dim to realise this wasn't a grade A disaster.
Yeah.
He should never have been allowed to do it. It is quite interesting that the Queen's name is mentioned, and whether she would have vetoed him doing it. And we hear that the Queen said, well, I'll leave it down to your judgment, to her second son. Obviously a fatal error. And of course, it's something from which he can never recover. Yeah. There is a way back, but there's no possibility ever with these 2 productions coming up, the one that's out today, which I saw this morning, and the one that's coming later. There's no way he's going to come back to public life or royal life in any real sense. I mean, the future is on the golf course with him, and having all the pleasures of being a grandfather and having a private life. As Muhammad Ali said in a completely different context, the chances of him coming back there's only 2, between slim and none. Yeah. And this means that the none is even more cemented into the fabric of our society. It's a great tragedy. It's extremely well done, I must say. Gillian Anderson gives a scintillating performance as Emily Maitlis, Billy Piper as the star of the show, Sam McAllister. And it's very much her show, and there we see her. And there we see her with Keeley Hawes in her sort of her best role, mothering Prince Andrew. But unfortunately, if she was giving him advice, it was the wrong advice, and it resulted in disaster. Yeah. But what you also do see, and you saw a bit of it there, the BBC politics, the backstabbing, the fact that the person who made the interview happen, the booker, gets no credit at all. And when she reads the write-up about the show, her name isn't mentioned. Well, I'm afraid that's par for the course. That's how the BBC has always been. The people at the top take all the credit, and the people who do the work get nothing. Yeah. So it's interesting for insiders like us. But you, as a very, very experienced newsman, when you'd heard that, you'd have realised this is going to make headlines forever around the world. And there's no recovery from it.
Absolutely spot on. It's a great analysis, Michael. Just a very final point. We are short on time, but despite the King being away from public business for a little while because he's obviously having treatment for cancer, we do understand that he's told his team around him, his aides, to ramp up plans for a 2-week state visit to Australia. It's interesting we found this out, so he's clearly very determined to get back in the saddle, as it were.
Yeah. Great show. I mean, the royal show must go on. I admire his courage and stickability. It's going to be tough for the lady we see in that screen, the Queen Camilla. She hates long-haul air journeys. Well, don't we all? But you see that on Windsor on Saturday. He went out and he shook every single person's hand. Everybody had been allowed inside the castle precincts. I think he was pleased to be back. And look at that. He's got guts. I'll give him that. And it's not just Australia, you know, it's New Zealand, and then on to Samoa for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. So I wish him well. That's in October. I hope he continues to make a recovery. Obviously, he's undergoing chemotherapy, and that can be no fun.
Yep.
But we all wish him well. And it's very important for the integrity of the Commonwealth and his overseas realms that he goes there and he reminds the Australians and the New Zealanders that he's their king and he has their best interests at heart.
Indeed. Michael, always thorough stuff. Great to talk. Have a cracking weekend. Thank you, Michael Cole, royal commentator.